Welcome back, all of you. I hope you had a good time connecting during our break, be it online or on site here. We're now in a somewhat smaller group, as you can see. That's important because we really want to collaborate and interact more in this format. This means that we need all of your inputs to make this working session work, literally. Your questions and comments are welcome. Make sure that we hear about your insights at the Slido page we mentioned before. So, and I'm sure that you will actually have plenty of thoughts on our subject this afternoon. After all, it's a decisive one in the transformation to sustainable development. In short, we will talk money now. Yeah, that's, as you can see, that is what makes the world go round, as they say. There's no doubt that more capital is needed to reach the goals set in Paris, as well as the SDGs. And granted, sustainable finance has increased in rich countries mostly in recent years, but this is far from enough. The crucial task is to get sustainable investments right everywhere, be it north or south, east or west. This is why we've brought together experts in international cooperation and leaders in both the public and the private sector today to discuss how scaling up sustainable investment in developing countries can happen. We'll talk about the challenges, of course, but we won't stop there. By the end of this afternoon, we really want to have a better understanding of how international cooperation can accelerate the use of private funds and social investments in emerging countries. To elaborate on this, I now welcome the Assistant Director General and Head of Global Cooperation at the Swiss Development Corporation, Mr. Christian Frutiger. Hello, Christian. So, first of all, you are a public sector guy, right? Why worry at all about the role of private investment in sustainable finance?
Well, first of all, hi, Arthur. There's a big financing gap in sustainable development. If we want to reach the 2030 agenda, the sustainable development goals, I think the investment gap per annum is something like 3.7 trillion, which is huge. It's like 150 times what official government assistance amounts to. So we need to find a way to unlock additional funding, which should go to the poorest. Maybe, today we're here at a conference in Geneva, but 4 months ago there was another conference here in Geneva that tries to build bridges between the financial sector and the international development sector. And just among the financial market representatives there, so those who would be inclined and interested to invest into development, I think there was something like 4 trillion of assets under management. So, if we could channel a sizable amount of that towards the Sustainable Development Goals, that would be a big deal.
Yeah, that's quite some change there. Yeah, 4 trillion, I can see that. But the corporate world with enough resources. I mean, why should taxpayer money be spent to make the financial sector invest in the fight against climate change and not leave it up to the banks and the financial industry themselves?
Because it's not going to happen all by itself. Some of it is happening, and we'll hear more about this. But we want the money also to go to the poorest in the most vulnerable countries. We want real needs to be addressed, and we want sustainable impact. So there's a question of risk. So the poorer a country, the higher the risk or the perceived risk. Is that reality? We'll hear something, I think, this afternoon about default rates and that they're actually not so bad in Africa compared to the rest of the world. So we can work with the private sector, with the financial sector on de-risking some of these investments, on lowering some of the perceived risk through technical assistance and other tools. And we have them at the Swiss Development Agency and also at the State Secretariat for the Economy. And so we're really trying to push investments into the right direction. Also by trying out new instruments. Just earlier in the session before, you heard the mayors, the cities that have difficulties to access the international financial ecosystem, because that's done at sovereign level, that's not at state level. You have other organizations, like river basin organizations that manage transboundary river basins that also have difficulties to access funding, because they're not limited to one country and they're not actually an entity, so they don't have a credit rating, they cannot access this type of funding. So we're really trying to, on the one side, de-risk, and on the other side, nudge and then explore new funding sources.
I can see how you do this for certain projects in certain areas, but what about the larger picture, about the international or even global standards for sustainable finance?
Well, we will always bring the development perspective to the table. The standards are being elaborated, and where we are part of the conversation, we will bring the development perspective to the table. We've heard the poorest have actually had least to do with the situation we are in today in terms of climate change, and we just want to make sure that they're not yet again disadvantaged.
And it is a mountain of tasks that you're facing. How do you think this session today can help tackle some of these issues?
Well, we would like honest and open discussions, talk about the real issues. Let's not only talk about climate and environment and how to finance that, let's also talk about the social aspect. It's always about people. So it's not only about investing in infrastructure or in investing in big landscaping solution. At the end of the day, it's about investing in people and what that means. And this is really something we should not forget. And then the most important point, please be as concrete as possible. And because at the end of the day, it's the impact on the ground which makes a difference, much more than conferences in Geneva, albeit they're great, but it really has to get traction on the ground. And the last point is we will take you by your word. If you make promises, we will note it down, and we will come back and talk to you so you can make good on the promises.
Yes, we'll keep score, as we like to do in Switzerland. Yes, thank you. And I think having the people in the center and being concrete, that's a good starting point. Christian Frutiger, everyone. So our next speaker knows more about sustainable finance in its various forms than just about anyone, I'd say. Here to explain the potential of responsible investment and also highlight the challenges is the head of the finance initiative at the UN Environment Programme, Mr. Eric Usher. Eric, please.
Well, thank you very much. And I think that the comments we've heard from Christian, I think it poses the question of the types of the purpose that an organization has, whether it's public or private. Does it have to be so different? And I think with the topic we're going to talk about today is in the norm of sustainable finance. What does it mean? And how are we starting to see it, say, filtering in to the private sector, how it's being applied, and largely in a way of this notion of maybe redefining purpose. We're going to have a couple questions to help frame the discussion, and then after I finish, you're going to get onto the real talks with a number of more deep dives on breaking down some of the issues, particularly within the scope of emerging markets in developing countries. My name is Eric Usher. I'm the head of what's called the UNEP-FI. If you don't know us, we are based here in Geneva, but we're part of the UN. We were established actually at the Rio Earth Summit 30 years ago. It's our anniversary this year. Where a number of banks and insurance companies attended the summit and saw something going on, discussions between governments, and said, we need a framework to be able to understand, learn from these intergovernmental processes, and also contribute to them. And you might know us if you're in the investment industry. The Principles for Responsible Investment is the first major framework that we established 15 years ago. And then maybe the largest, particularly in the context of these discussions today, just 2 years ago, we established the Principles for Responsible Banking. And we're very pleased there's a large uptake from around the world. We're getting towards 50% of global banking assets which are covered, including a very strong contingent within Switzerland. Maybe if I could ask to put the first question up on the screen. And okay, it's already up there. We're putting the key issues, and this is what we're going to start to, I think, tackle today. When we think about sustainable finance, what do we mean? And I think there is some sort of a knee-jerk reaction sometimes about, oh, those bankers, they can't be trusted. Why are they talking about sustainability issues? So it's a very interesting space. A lot is happening now, today. But the reality is the notion of sustainable finance goes back quite some time. Money lending goes back since ancient times. But modern banking started in 16th century Italy. And interestingly, at the time, the Catholic Church was very involved, and they were setting very clear rules, essentially guidelines on how to prevent usury, the money lending at unreasonable rates. And interestingly, if you looked at, for instance, Monte dei Pieta, which is one of the largest banks of the day, if you look at their guidelines, it actually looks like a CSR statement. It promotes lending to women, to local communities, to public institutions. So already the notion of the purpose of a bank was being well instilled hundreds of years ago. We had the credit unions and the cooperatives that came to light in the 18th century, aimed at basically servicing agricultural populations, the poorer populations within the cities within the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. So back then, banks, the notion of banking with purpose, it really got going, I think, on a positive footing. We have Sharia finance, also with similar type notions of preventing usury. So notions of sustainable finance are not new. However, I think some would say, and as we see maybe as we start to see the word cloud, to some extent they maybe have gotten lost within an economic system which possibly is incentivizing value creation, often in ways that are at conflict with values. And basically the notion of banking with purpose, some would basically say, oh, that's a niche concept. That's not something that mainstream actors do. We had the global financial crisis, and I think that really the financial system was largely involved in creating that crisis. And it has led to a decade or more of rethinking in terms of what is the purpose of the financial sector, of banking and the like. Some progress has been made. I think if we look at the COVID crisis, one thing we can say is it's been terribly difficult on many parts of society, but the banking sector, the financial sector actually has played its role. The financial system did not collapse, and that was actually a combination of regulatory public financing and the role of the private banks. And so it was one type of example where the financial sector actually has stepped up in a positive way. So if we look at the cloud, I think this is probably indicative of one of the challenges that many in the financial sector would say today, is that there's so many different views on what sustainability, what ESG is. There is so many different reporting requirements. The metrics are not clear. We need to get more bringing together of what exactly we're talking about. We as an industry, and we as in our interface with our clients, be it corporates, be it at the retail level, be it regulators, be it civil society, and even our employees, we need to increasingly clarify what sort of language we're speaking, the terminology that we're using. But I think we are making progress in those directions now. One of the important steps in terms of intergovernmental was within the Paris Agreement signed in 2015. There's this famous paragraph 2.1c. Now, the beauty of these agreements is everybody has one paragraph that they love or that they hate, and they think the whole agreement is about that. But 2.1c basically says, we, the parties, so countries who sign the agreement, will endeavor to align the financial system, public and private financial flows, with the objective of Paris Agreement, so maintaining a global temperature well below 2 degrees by end of century. That's a very important foundational element, because it put the mandate on governments not only about what they should do with their public finances, but what they should do to help align private finances with a global sustainability objective. Since Paris, we have seen a lot of progress. We have the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, very wordy. But basically, most corporates today are starting to disclose on climate risks, which is, I think, very important. You have a good breadth of disclosures, which means many corporates are doing it. The depth of disclosures in terms of the quality, the comparability of the disclosures, they're not good enough today. But what we have seen is what started as a voluntary initiative, it's from the private sector. Now we're starting to see regulators coming in and saying, okay, we've seen what you've done voluntarily. Now we're going to start to ratchet up and standardize how these disclosures are done. And we believe that relationship between public and private is critical to addressing sustainability challenges. This is not about sitting back and waiting to be regulated. This is not about the private sector being able to do it all on their own. This is about a coming together, public and private, in terms of mandate, in terms of expertise. And this is what we're starting to see happening. However, there has also been great growth in the green bonds market, and we're going to hear more today about work being done on green bonds within emerging markets, which is very important. This year, I think there's going to be about $500 billion US in issuance. It's quite remarkable. It's about 5% of global fixed income bond issuance. So it's definitely coming to a turning point. However, we would say the real transformation started in 2019 when, for the first time, we really started to see a much more holistic view on sustainability. And I would mark two developments. I already mentioned the launch of the Principles of Responsible Banking. For the first time, banks are stepping up. Today, it's nearly 300 banks, almost half of the financial system, who are saying we are going to put in place systems to manage impact across all of our lines of business. So it's not only the good stuff we do, the impact investing we do, it's also being more transparent about the things we do that we realize have a negative impact. That doesn't mean that we're going to stop or we can stop to do it overnight, but we're going to get transparent about this notion of impact management. And some of you may have heard around the Glasgow COP now in November, the IFRS announced the establishment of the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which for the first time in terms of financial reporting is going to bring in the notion of impact reporting. So starting in the last couple of years, all of a sudden, it's not about the good things you do, it's about everything you do and being transparent about it. The other thing that started in 2019, this notion of net zero. Up until 2019, you had basically the Europeans and small island states at a country level who were committed to net zero. September 2019, President Xi of China announced that China would align net zero 2060. That started a domino effect, and by the time of the Biden summit and actually the Glasgow COP, we have 90% of global emissions which are under a net zero commitment at the country level. Of course, a lot of work to be done to actually translate that into policies. But at the same time, the financial sector and others in the private sector stepped up, and we have what's called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is an umbrella of alliances. We manage 3 of the sub-alliances: Net Zero Banking Alliance, Asset Owner Alliance, and an Insurance Alliance. And these are the private sector actors coming together to say, how do we work together to develop the common methodologies to totally decarbonize? 2050 is the easy part. It's about interim milestones, and 2030 is the main focus. What do we need to do to decarbonize by 2030? Once again, it's going to take a lot of new green stuff, so the good stuff, but it's about actually coming to terms with all the stuff that's the opposite of green. You can use whatever term to say gray, brown, but basically it's about being holistic and understanding that sustainability is about the whole. And when we talk about sustainable finance, it's about a question of purpose. What is our role in the economy? And our definition would be the role of finance is to finance the needs of society. And what is a sustainable society, both in terms of human capital, but also in terms of nature, climate, etc. And so it's about getting the purpose right, and then it's about understanding all lines of business and understanding what sort of impacts we have and what can we do about it. It does not expect that overnight everything will change, because banks, investors are central to how our economy functions today. And our economy does not function in all the right ways. And change happens not only because an investor or a banker wants it to happen. There are many actors that need to be involved. So just in terms of my final comments, this change of total decarbonization, of aligning with sustainability objectives, of understanding the notion of impact, when we come into the developing world, into emerging markets, it's all the more critical for so many reasons that you would know very well. The challenges are larger, the impacts are more significant in both a positive and also a negative way. And so the role of the financial system and the role of development finance becomes critical. But how can we put in place the systems and capacities to really step up and do it together? So I actually had a second question. My apologies, I didn't put it up. Sorry, we've been a little bit out of sync how we've been talking. So we've jumped to the third question. And begging the question is, what is the role of what do we need to do in terms of public-private cooperation as we move forward? And we believe that the job of development finance is more critical than ever. But the how we do it, we have to be constantly thinking about not only, and as I think as many of you know, not only doing the stuff that's most exciting, but also crossing the hall within these organizations and understanding what everybody else is doing and figuring out how they can get involved as well. So it's about the whole. It's about the role of the commercial financial actors. How can they complement and work alongside the public actors? And of course, doing it in a holistic way that leads to sustainable economic development widely. So I think with that, I'll stop. And my apologies that I ran over the questions. I think we see responses to people's views on the use of development cooperation funds, and I think we're going to have further discussions now to follow up actually in each one of these areas. And I think as we kind of see overall that when push comes to shove, there are issues like risk sharing where the private sector has a very hard time doing it on its own, and therefore there's a very good rationale for aligning public and private, including in a blended finance way. But then there's also the wider framing and the notions around sustainability where the institutional capacities will need to be really ratcheted, and I think there's a really important role for development cooperation there as well. So with that, thank you, and looking forward to the session's discussions.
Thank you, Eric. It's fascinating to see these answers rolling in also with the word cloud we had before, to see how you're involved in this discussion. I really like that. Now, with these inputs, we've defined the focus of this session. Now it's time to add another key perspective. When talking about bringing private investors to developing countries, the experience at the International Finance Corporation is second to none. And climate business ranks high among the priorities at the IFC these days, so I'm sure you'll have many thoughts and questions for our next speaker. Please use that Slido tool you've just used for the polls so we can integrate your questions shortly. We'll now hear from a man who has more than 20 years of experience in international finance, from agribusiness to infrastructure, from manufacturing to financial services. Please welcome the Manager of Climate Finance and Policy at the IFC, Mr. Anup Yagwani.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you to SECO and SDC for inviting me to this event. I'm really happy to be here. We appreciate the support SECO provides in some of the work that we do. So while I'm going to talk about the Green Bond Technical Assistance Program that has been supported by SECO, just 30 seconds on IFC. Most of you know, but we are the private sector arm of the World Bank and focused on the private sector. So for year on year, we get out there and we invest in private sector clients in the emerging market context only. And this is where, some of the examples that Christian referred to or Eric referred to, this is where the rubber hits the road. We have policies in place that we implement. Some of you know about our performance standards. That's become the benchmark for the industry. And so every year we put out over $20 billion for our own account. When it comes to climate finance, We do about $4 billion a year of our own account, and we mobilize another, $3.5 billion or so last year as we did. So about $7.5 billion in climate finance in the emerging market context, purely in the emerging market context. Blended finance is an important part of it. But we use it very judiciously, and it depends on the situation. We take what is the subsidy being provided, why is it being provided. To give you a good sense, today solar doesn't need that subsidy, large-scale solar. We don't provide that subsidy for solar. But if it's distributed generation, then that's maybe where subsidy is needed. So we are very judicious in the use of blended finance, but we think it plays a really important role in pushing the boundaries as far as development is concerned, and sustainable development. So today I'll talk about the Green Bond Technical Assistance Program, GBTAP for short, so I don't have to repeat this long phrase every time. And let me start with a video on this, if you can please.
A green bond is a financial tool to borrow money for investments that have a positive impact on the environment, like wind farms, sustainable agriculture, green buildings, the list goes on. Two words: climate change. Extreme weather events such as droughts, flooding, heat waves are becoming more common and severe. And emerging markets are hit the hardest because of their weaker infrastructure and support systems. Green bonds help developing countries mobilize the funds needed to protect livelihoods in a warming climate and to decarbonize their economies. Well, we're one of the first institutions to issue a green bond back in 2010. And 3 years later, we facilitated the largest green bond in history. So far, IFC has issued $10 billion in green bonds across the globe to finance clean energy and a sustainable future. In the process, we've helped reduce greenhouse gas emissions by over 21 million metric tons of CO2 per year. That's equivalent to the annual emissions of over 6 million cars. IFC also invests in green bonds issued by others, playing a leading role in promoting sustainable investments and developing standards and guidelines for the financial industry. Transitioning away from carbon reliance is a major challenge, and we at IFC are facing it head on. Want to find out more? Visit our website.
So let me go back to, so this, for some of you who don't know what green bonds do, that was just an intro, and we're leveraging this capability that we have as IFC in the green bond space, and following the Amundi investment, which was 3 years ago, essentially what we did there was we said, okay, we're going to address the demand side and the supply side. So the Amundi investment for a little over $200 million that IFC put in, we took the lower tranche and we brought in institutional investors from Europe in making a fund of $1.5 billion plus. And so we mobilized capital from the developed markets to invest in emerging market bonds from banks in the emerging market context. So that's the demand side we took care of. But there's a supply side problem. And so that's where GBTAP comes in, and the support of SECO. We went about training banks, and our training banks every other month. We run a cohort. We essentially help train the banks in how they go about issuing a green bond, what do they need to do, hand-holding. So we run trainings and then actually get on in the field in helping them at the institution level to execute those. So what we're doing is essentially we produce climate finance champions around the world by doing this capacity building. This gives you a sense of what I mentioned, the Amundi Go Fund, 30 green bonds in their portfolio, over $818 million invested, and $10 billion in nominal value of these bonds. So in a nutshell, we identify the emerging markets, those FIs, that have green bond issuance potential. We start with the ones that have already issued bonds in the international market, and then we talk to them and say, hey, how about issuing a green bond? And then we train and provide that one-on-one support to equip them with technical knowledge to issue these bonds. These FI green bond issuances thereby increase market supply of the climate financing. And then this mobilized investment in climate projects supporting climate adaptation and mitigation related projects. One of the videos I couldn't show you was an example in Turkey where we support, this fund essentially supported a bank, ISBank, that went on to support several mitigation projects in the Turkish context. There are key components that we had when we looked at the program. We said there are different parts that need to come in. There are 6 essential parts. There's the Green, Social, and Sustainability Bonds Executive Training Program. That's the bulk of the work. And then we have the Green Bond Principles, Communication, and Dissemination. So this is a lot of knowledge sharing. We've got a Green Bond handbook that we just released. We've got biodiversity sort of assets that you can invest in. So there is the knowledge that we're sharing with others. We enhance quality reporting. So a key part of the green bond issuance process is reporting. And so a lot of the banks struggle with that, and we help them do that. There are other knowledge sharing initiatives that we undertake in component 4. And then the 5th one is essentially working at the policy level. Later on in one of the panels, you'll hear from Mariana, where in the Colombian context, we helped in setting up the taxonomy in this context. And so that helps really create the framework in many instances to attract the green capital. And then finally, component 6 is working, as I mentioned early on, with one-on-one support to the banks that want to issue these green bonds. And there's some fantastic stories I'm happy to share. Unfortunately, we won't have time in this short session. So the results so far, and it's much more than that number already, the 650 plus trained market stakeholders, more than 40% female, 90 plus trained financial institutions, 35 plus emerging market participants countries, 35 countries from across the world, 280 market partners and collaborators. Here we bring in people like ICMA and others to partner with us. And then 41 green, social, and sustainability bond issuances by these institutions, and 1.7 million tons in CO2 emissions avoided, and 11 countries given green bond policies supported. So that was, if you remember the previous slide, the components, these 11 countries have been supported in this. That represents a total volume of over 3 billion in financing, of 70% of which is green. And why is that 70% green? Because over the last 2 years, we saw a lot of social issuances. So some of the banks we trained, COVID context, they decided to go for social bonds rather than green bonds. And this is my last slide. Challenges, of course, with COVID, we had to adjust. This forum that we have in person today is a new beginning in many ways. For the last 2 years, we've been online, and so we had to change the format of how we operate. The industry trends in the issuance of sustainability bonds over green bonds to address COVID-19 that I just mentioned. Challenges among green bond issuers in producing impact reports. So this is when banks say, okay, now that I've issued this green bond, there's impact reporting. How do I go about getting the data? And you'll see this constantly come up, the data challenges. There's high demand for technical training that we're continuing. So many of the cohorts we've trained have asked for more focused training on certain aspects of the green bond process. And then there's lack of market reporting standardization approaches. Finally, what more can development partners do? Of course, more blended finance structures, as I mentioned. Clearly, they help galvanize capital from the private sector and the technical capacity building. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to interacting in the panel after this.
Thank you. Thank you, Arnab. Just stay with me for a sec. I think we got a couple of questions for you. The first one that got the most votes was that between 2016 and 2020, the world's 60 largest private sector banks funneled a staggering $3.8 trillion into fossil fuel projects and companies globally. How to change that trajectory in the short time that is left?
So it's a how many $1 trillion question. Look,
3.8.
So when I talk about this journey, I think the banks need to start now. Several of the banks have made commitments to get out of coal in 2030 and 2040. Our last coal project was 11 years ago. we have to take the steps now. There is no other way. And if it's regulation that's going to make it happen, then so be it. Because I don't see banks on their own when they're earning these incomes from the fossil fuels. You just saw in the news, FT yesterday, actually, the income for the financing that the banks provided was similar to 2 years ago, pre-COVID, for the fossil fuel industry, and coal projects in particular. So I'm not sure, apart from policy, there's really a way. Carbon price, we've struggled with that, putting a tax price on carbon, if there's a way to do that. At a global level, I know Europe's taking the lead in having some sort of a carbon tax with a lot of resistance from the rest of the world, but that's another way. So it's really policy and putting a price on carbon that will incentivize this. Otherwise, and of course, the geopolitical situation today does not help us get to that route faster.
Let's also talk about the other side, if you will. There's one question from Shahid Ali, if I can read that correctly. Are there any priorities in regards to financing specific industry projects, for example, in solar energy?
So we see development as multifaceted. When you look at our business, half our business is with financial institutions, the other 25% is about infrastructure, and the last is manufacturing, agribusiness, and services. So when you look at this multifaceted development, you can't leave out any one sector. And so what you've got to do is take the lens of what is the least GHG emitting pathway. Of course, you've got to target the highest emitters if you want to look at mitigation. I was giving an example to somebody on the World Bank Group is developing these climate country development reports, right? Country climate development reports. So they combine climate and development in one context. So when I sat in a session for Nepal, and Nepal's emissions are about 50 million tons. It's not a mitigation issue in that country. It's an adaptation issue in that country with the challenges that they face. Of course, you could do something about putting EVs in there, and you could decarbonize on the margins, but that's not where your problem is. You want to focus on. So to your question, it depends on the context, I think, that you want to focus on. If it's mitigation, then you look at, I use another example in Mozambique when we were supporting a gas project a couple of years back, and we had a lot of discussion at the board. Should we be doing this? Not. We looked at all the alternatives, how gas was helping to decarbonize the entire coal-heavy grid, but also creating a base for renewables. But guess what? Mozambique's emissions are 1% of Germany's emissions. Are we focusing on the right question there? We have energy poverty there, and here we're talking about emissions in that context. Of course we should look at it, but here's putting things in context. Land use change represents a much bigger challenge for Mozambique as far as GHG emissions go. That's where we should focus on in the Mozambique context. So it depends on the context, and that's what we should focus on. And finally, the last thought is, of course, the new technologies that we can galvanize. And for the energy transition, I think that needs a big push, whether it's hydrogen or battery storage, that can make renewables much more reliable and replace for some of the peak loads that we have instead of gas and being the base load or fossil. You could have renewable plus battery storage as the cost curve comes down as one of the mechanisms to address that challenge on the energy side. So there are many solutions. It depends on the context and what you bring into that.
Point that you made there, that different countries, different regions in the world need different approaches. Thank you, Anna, and we'll see you on the panel to talk more about this. Thanks. Anna Virwani. Now, investing in sustainability where the money is needed the most, I think we can all agree that's a good thing. But rumor has it that doing good isn't all that counts in investing. Well, maybe an extra incentive can nudge investors in the right direction. Explaining this in detail will now be Anna Ingwe from the German Society for International Cooperation. She's joining us online. Anna? I think we can see you, but not hear you yet.
Can you hear me?
Now it's good.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here today to shed some light on an innovative result-based financing approach called the Social Impact Incentive, in short, SINC. What is innovative about SINC is the specific focus on the social outcomes. Next slide, please. SDC is a long-term strategic partner of the multi-donor Energizing Development Partnership, who are working together towards the common goal of contributing to achieving universal energy access. The partnership started in 2005 and is present in more than 20 countries around the globe. And so far, Endeavour has reached about 25.8 million people. And since 2014, result-based financing has become an integral part of our operations. Next slide, please. Now, we're continuously working on new approaches with potential for upscaling. And this is where the SINC approach comes in. In Kenya, we are currently implementing a pilot with the objective to establish SINC in the toolbox to support energy access in developing countries. And you can see from the graphics, SDC acts as the outcome pair, providing funds. And then we have Endeavour taking up the role as project implementer who designs and manages the project. And we have 3 impact enterprises who have embarked with us on this journey. And then we have an impact verifier who measures to which extent the pre-agreed social impacts have been achieved. Now, what's important here to notice is not the products, but the impact these products have on the lives of the people who are benefiting. And on the right, we have the investors who benefit from the improved cash flow and optimized impact model of these enterprises. So in short, these companies are basically incentivized for their positive impacts on clients' lives. They receive payment for successful verified results. Now, I would like to invite you to virtually travel to my home country, Kenya, and to get to know one of the social enterprise in a short video. Thank you.
The contrast between an urban setting and a rural setting is becoming ever more stark. At Bidasasa, we developed a women-to-women sales network that enables women to buy any kind of product on payment plans. We provide household goods such as efficient stoves for cooking, solar products for lighting and phone charging, and also agricultural products. The SINC project is helping us to really still pay attention to our core market and help us to reach poorer customers and add something financially to really help with the bottom line.
Majiko ambayo wametuletea ni majiko ya kisasa. Tunaweka makaa kama 5 na yanapika chakula kinaiva.
Saa hii kwa hiyo area yetu lita moja ni shilingi 105. Sasa hizi pesa zote ingekuwa vile nilikuwa singeweza. Sasa hii naona ni rahisi kwa sababu naweka tu taa kwa jua na taa inachukua na naonea taa.
We've seen many enterprises kind of abandon that market for those reasons. The difficulty of reaching rural customers and the difficulty of reaching out to women who are not necessarily a mainstream customer or target customer in Kenya.
Bidhaa sasa wameweza kutusaidia, si ile unaenda alafu unaweka pesa mingi kwa wakati mmoja. Wametupea nafasi at least tunakuwa na bidhaa na tunazitumia tukilipia malipo ya polepole, na yeye inatusaidia katika mahitaji yetu ya kila siku, inatupea nafasi angalau ya kufanya vitu viwili vitatu.
We really appreciate the help and assistance offered by GIZ and Endeavour on this project. Next for Bidasasa will be to further increase our operational efficiencies, and we've also started a small pilot in Uganda, just across the border from our first operations, and trying to understand the market there, where the core customer base is very much the same. The question is also then, how do we serve them with a business model that is as much as possible aligned to the one in Kenya?
Okay, thank you very much. Now, you may be asking yourself if the pilot would make a difference. This is a valid question, but the objective of the pilot is to prove the concept in energy access. And the sink story is much larger than this. Sink and impact-linked finance is expanding pretty fast. And at the moment, there are over 20 transactions in more than 15 countries on 3 continents, targeting education, agriculture, and water being implemented. And then there's migration and clean energy in preparation. And here, SDC is taking a leading role and not acting in isolation, but with other partners to provide funding. They have committed more than $120 million US, leveraging private investment between 1 and 4 times the amount provided. Therefore, as NDEV, we strive to contribute another piece to the puzzle in responding to the challenges where energy access, renewable energy, and climate change come together. We all know that achieving SDG 7 and combating climate change requires a joint effort, and that energy is a crucial precondition to achieving social impacts in other sectors too. Therefore, development cooperation acts as a bridge builder and supporter to explore avenues to scale up sustainable investment in developing countries, and at the same time bringing together enterprises and investors. And what is important here, we should not forget, this is not just about the number of stores and solar products we push out to the users, but what is really touching on the lives of these people? What impact does these technologies have on the actual lives of the people? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Anna. I hope you heard the applause you got in the room here. And please stay with us. We're going to do a little Q&A session after. So if you have questions for Anna, please use Slido right now. But I first want to bring in our next speaker because it's a somewhat related topic. There is easier ways to make money than supporting the transformation to sustainability in the global south, of course. Many investors shy away from the opportunities here because of what they call adverse financing conditions. In plain terms, there's just too much risk. This is where initiatives come in that can help lower that risk. And Philippe Valahue, the Chief Executive Officer of the Private Infrastructure Development Group, will tell us more about this. Please, Philippe.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. And thank you very much for having me here today. I think I've got 5 or 7 minutes, and there are probably 3 themes that I would like to focus on during the 3 or 4 slides that I will go through. One is the risk sharing that the speaker just mentioned, the risk sharing element. The second one is blended finance, because that is what we are all about. And then the other one is the focus on renewable energy, because I could be here all day speaking to you about what we do, but I decided to, in agreement with the organizers, to focus a little more on the renewable energy space, which we work on. So for those of you who do not know Page, the 30-second primer, set up 20 years ago by 4 like-minded governments in Europe. I would call them visionary governments, and that included Switzerland, via SECO, who today remains one of our strongest supporters, and I'm obviously extremely grateful for that support. But those 4 governments identified impediments to providing development and finance for infrastructure assets in sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia. Top among them was the availability of long-term commercial debt. And when I say long-term, 15, 20-year debt. Unavailability of guarantees in local currency. Unavailability of local project development money to take a project to financial close or through construction. So they came together to set up what is today known as the Private Infrastructure Development Group. And I think there are 2 or 3 things that are worth pointing out, over 55% of the business we do is in the so-called FCAS countries. So these are the fragile, conflict-affected situations. So these are the poor of the poor. These are the risky countries where traditionally private investors will shy away from, but I'll show you how that doesn't have to be the case. And whilst blended finance is at the heart of what we do and what we deliver, the PIDGE itself is a wonderful instrument or an example of blended finance. So while we have government funding initially from the likes of SECO and some other European governments, we also have institutional investors that have come into the mix over the years. Allianz is one example, or commercial banks that have come into the mix. Standard Chartered is another example. So that's an important one. The other thing is we focus on infrastructure and only infrastructure. So that makes us quite focused, although it does include social infrastructure, which is student accommodation, I'll come back to it, health sector, and affordable housing, all of which we have shown, be done with the private sector by providing the de-risking that we do. And so that's the fourth element. Everything we do, everything we touch is about de-risking investments. We are not coming into a project to be there for the long term. We're not looking to be a long-term asset manager. We will develop an asset, and as soon as the market understands or appreciates or thinks it is sufficiently de-risked, we will turn it over, we get our cash back, and we redeploy that money to be used for the next transaction. And I think that's a very important distinction. When you look at the group, we cover the full life cycle of an infrastructure asset, from upstream TA, so feasibility study, working with regulators, to project development on the ground, and to providing various forms of debt, products, and guarantees. I'll give a couple examples because I think it's important, because it means also that we work across the capital structure. So Anoop talked about green bonds, and so that's one area that we've been developing, but by mobilizing domestic institutional investors. Because one of the things we want to be about is not necessarily the cross-border piece, but mobilizing and developing the local piece of the equation. So we underwrote or provided credit enhancement, for example, last year for the first ever green bond in East Africa, listed on the Nairobi Stock Exchange, to provide funding via Kenyan pension funds and insurance companies to student accommodation. So this is the building of a building for students at the University of Nairobi. And that is EDGE certified for those who are familiar with that. So that's an important piece. The other part, and I think a couple speakers and Christian alluded to it earlier, on the debt side, which is the largest piece of our business, and the oldest within the PIDGE group, 20 years of experience, the loan loss ratio, and that will resonate with some of the finance specialists in the room, the loan loss ratio over 20 years is 0.5%. I'd like you to compare that to North America. The stats are available. Moody's and S&P's publish those for infrastructure-type project finance transactions. So I think what we try to demonstrate is you can, as a bank, come into Chad, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Mozambique, as we do through our debt fund, and achieve those loss ratios that we have been able to achieve over the last 20 years. On climate strategy, and again, I said today that these are a few sectors where we are operating, and I will focus on renewable energy and a couple of case studies to bring life to this discussion in Sierra Leone, amongst others. I think there are a couple things to highlight. In 2019, we began to implement internally Paris Agreement alignment KPIs for everything that we do, amongst the various product lines that we provide. In January 20, we signed up to the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and in early 21, we did our first disclosure report. We also include the physical and transition risks of climate change as an integral part of the underwriting of our transactions before they can go to investment committee or credit committee, depending on whether you're talking equity or debt. And so unless that has a green light from the team that oversees that, that project will not make its way to investment or credit committees. And so that's allowed us to work in the wind space, Cape Verde, Pakistan by way of example, in the solar space in Vietnam, Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, to name a few. So I'll focus the remaining 2 or 3 minutes that I have on 2 examples, as I said, to bring it a bit more to life. This is a project that we picked up in 2012, which was a distressed asset, and by that I mean local investors had tried to develop it. Koh San is located in the North Vietnam, close to the border with China. They had run out of cash to develop this project, the 30 megawatt run-of-river hydro. So we came in, picked it up, and assumed the cost of developing that project. We achieved financial close in 2015, I believe. We tried to exit, but the market didn't view the project as sufficiently de-risked, and largely because there was no experience yet of payment by Électricité du Vietnam and whether or not it would be making its payments on time every 6 months. So we stayed through construction, plus another 1 or 2 years, and then we put it out to market, 40 expressions of interest, and we ended up selling it to a Japanese company for whom it was its first foray in the renewable energy space in Southeast Asia. So to make a long story short, the investment that we put in to develop the assets, the 10 million that you see at the bottom, is monies that we have then recouped plus a premium for taking the risk through construction, through COD, which then we put back into the business to develop the next asset. And that project today provides access or new or improved access to electricity to about 130,000 people in that region of North Vietnam. And then finally, you heard earlier this afternoon a speaker in Sierra Leone, and a few people have before me referred to Sierra Leone. And I think this is one of the areas or one of the projects that I like to highlight, both in terms of the de-risking, because I said this to a couple of colleagues earlier in the day. I spent a lot of time in London, and inevitably you go to a conference and people will ask you to comment on Africa risk. And I look at them dumbfounded and say, do you talk about Europe risk? Do you compare Swiss risk to German risk to Portuguese risk to Greek risk? No, you don't. So why would you talk about Africa risk today? 30 years maybe because of systemic risk issues, but not today. You can't compare the different risk in the 52 countries that we operate in. That just doesn't work that way. The other thing to keep in mind, you will hear repeatedly at conferences that 550 or 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa do not have access to electricity. And I'm afraid that that statistic that is being repeated for the last 10 years has started to wear off and wear thin on people because it's become accepted, and so what? And so unless you address the underlying issues, so for example, accepting once and for all that you're not going to get baseload capacity in rural communities because governments will not have the money to pay for transmission capacity, and nor will multilateral development banks have sufficient capital to do that. So you have to look at the off-grid, mini-grid space. And maybe 5, 7 years, people were smiling at me when we were talking about solar solutions and off-grid solutions. People are not smiling anymore today. In this country, in Sierra Leone, 2% of people outside the cities have access to electricity. That's 2%. So this project, which is a small, working with a company called PowerGen, has allowed us to provide, in an off-grid model, 12,000 new connections, which provides access to 75,000 people. And equally, or more importantly, 2,000 new connections to SMEs. And an SME can be a barbershop, it can be a carpenter, but for these people, it transforms their lives. It allows them to provide for their families. And so this is why, for us, this is quite important, and whether it's small or large. So the de-risking part, PowerGen is a private sector company who has come in with us. And today we are probably the second or third largest developer of off-grid, mini-grid solutions in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, our plan is not to be there for 20 years. Our plan is to demonstrate to both commercial banks and private investors that it is an area that is ripe for investment and that you can mitigate the risk that people are concerned with. So I think I've probably overstayed my welcome here with my 7 minutes, Arthur, and I will stop it here.
Thank you, Philippe. You did not overstay your welcome, of course. You're always welcome.
Move, right?
No, we can go over there, so we can have Anna in our round included right here, because now we would like to go to the question. And there is a question for Anna, actually, and it says, What is the NF strategy to make this approach sustainable over time so that eventually does not require donor support anymore?
Thank you very much for the question. I think one thing is very clear. The role of developmental cooperation is to support sustainable development. But this needs to be carefully done to support market development and not cause market distortion. So, and I want to highlight one thing with this approach. These companies already are saving low-income plans, targeting specifically women and vulnerable groups, but they're facing challenges in terms of when it comes to attracting investors. And this is the market barrier that needs to be overcome. So will the impact financing approach like SYNC be needed in the long term? It is possible to say yes and no. No, because when we work as development organization, we work to develop viable business models, which might not need further support in future. But also on the other hand, it is yes, because the impact financing model such as SYNC is very flexible and it can be adjusted and implemented in other sectors where support is still needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Another question that I noted actually myself while we listened to your speech is that organic food is more expensive than non-organic one, although the opposite should be true. And the same perverse incentive system seems to apply for sustainable investment. Philip, how to put a levy on the non-sustainable investments? How to put a levy on the non-sustainable investments? How to make sure that it's harder to invest in non-sustainable areas?
Probably going to answer the question in a way you don't want, but I'm going to try anyways. And I'm not trying to avoid the question, but it relates to a question that was on the immediate panel before with Anup. I was at COP26, and I think it was the first time that the financial industry was participating full-fledged as it did. And the question, I think that relates, was how do you get the financial sector to be doing things differently? And I think the dialogue that I saw begin, whilst many people came away, including myself, away from Glasgow slightly disappointed, and I'm measuring my words carefully, there was a dialogue that began that I hadn't seen before amongst all the various participants in the value chain. So not just the public sector, but private sector, and within the private sector, the financial institutions and banks. So I know this probably doesn't answer your question directly.
No, but what exactly did you see change?
I'm sorry?
What exactly did you see change in the dialogue?
I think in the dialogue, and people are no longer just paying lip service. And I think there was a sense in the various panels that I spoke at, or people that I had side private discussions with, that sense of urgency was not limited to specialists in the area now. I think there is we're still not there, obviously, otherwise we wouldn't be having these types of meetings, but a growing sense of ownership that I haven't seen present before.
Okay, let's see if we have time for one more question. How can the financial sector be motivated to stop financing polluting industries? What do you think, Anna?
I think, that's a, I really will request somebody from the financial sector to respond to that. But in my opinion, you see, I mean, I think some of the countries' regulation, if they are taking hold, that, I mean, they are being enforced to make sure that people are not polluting and therefore are able to access the investment money from the financial sector. That would be something which can still be done. But the problem we have in many countries, I would say even, for example, in my own countries, I mean, enforcement is one big problem for many, in many sectors. And it might be a little bit a trick situation, I would say. Maybe I will ask somebody from the financial sector. I'm really not coming from the financial sector, so I will not be able to answer it properly. Maybe I'll request somebody from the financial sector to respond to that. Thank you.
Yeah, but I think you made an important point with the enforcement there, and I'm sure that we will talk later on our panel as well about this and take this to some people from the financial sector who are represented here, of course, as well. For now, I thank you both, Anna Ingwe and Philippe Olahu. So think about it. While it's clear that the world won't reach sustainable, resilient, and inclusive growth, as we've talked about, outlined also in the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, without both public and private investments, it's a fact that green bonds and green funds, they are today mostly tied to investments in developed markets, while the challenges for sustainable development, they often occur in developing countries. We want to dig deeper on that and now learn from experts and come up with ideas on how to scale up sustainable investment, thereby bringing international cooperation to the next level, as we owe it to our planet in the end. So I welcome on my panel, joining us online is Mariana Escobar Uribe. Hello, Mariana. She's advisor to the Superintendent of Colombia. Then Patrick Audier, who's in the room. Patrick is president of Swiss Sustainable Finance and also president of Building Bridges. Yeah, please. Then Jörg Frieden, he's president of the board at the Swiss Investment Fund for Emerging Markets. Jörg. And you've already met Anup Yagwani. Anup, please join us again. Anup, the manager of climate finance and policy at the International Finance Corporation. And please remember there's also a fifth guest up here, albeit an invisible one. No, I have not brought my imaginary friend, don't worry. No, of course it's you. I really rely on your questions on Slido and your comments that you give us. As you can see, we try to integrate them as much as possible. They play a large part in our conversation, so you can just type away. We want to see more than emojis, even though I've heard that emojis are also part of this, so we might see some of those here in the Q&A later. Make sure that you note who the question is for, and also to keep it short and sweet, sweet as Swiss chocolate if you can. Thank you. All right, first I would like to get your feedback on what we've heard so far this afternoon, and the great opportunities that were presented, but the challenges that remain. I start with you, Mariana, because you have the view from the outside. Where do you think international cooperation should focus in the next years?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor for the Superintendencia to attend this event. Regarding the opportunities, I see a set of ideas or a set of different dimensions that international cooperation can work on, especially on what I know, which is sustainable finance. The first one is keep contributing in the development of green finance frameworks or sustainable finance frameworks. Even though Colombia as an emerging market have had a framework for greening the financial system now for a couple of years, we do see, and in the engagement we have with other players from emerging markets or developing countries, we do see the opportunity to keep engaging and keep helping these jurisdictions and these countries in developing the roadmap and the green finance framework. It sounds like an easy task, but sometimes you need help and support in order to really establish and develop something that responds to your context. The second one, I think it's related to international innovative instruments. I know there are many voluntary principles in the market, and they're very well recognized. However, we do think that countries need to understand how these principles are applied in their markets. In some countries like ours, we decided to issue regulation, but I do see the opportunity to keep engaging with regulators and capital market participants to see the value of these innovative instruments, such as green funds. Green bonds is the one we know the best, but there is also now sustainability-linked bonds. There is green credits. So keep engaging with the capital markets and financial institutions in understanding how these innovative instruments work. And I think finally, which is something we see, and it's one of the biggest barriers in Colombia, it's regarding the pipeline. So we do have a very active banking system in Colombia regarding sustainable finance. There have been a green protocol, which is a voluntary initiative from the banks regarding sustainability. They have had these voluntary principles since 2012. They're very interested, they're very well engaged. However, when we talk to them and when we speak to them, there are two barriers, and one of them, it's obviously the project pipeline. So you have to keep working with the real sector and with the SMEs, especially Colombia and emerging markets economies are based on SMEs. The SMEs are not issuers. However, they do need to first to understand how they can transition to a greener and more sustainable economy. How can they step by step change the way they produce and the way they operate, and that's another front. And I didn't want to end this small intervention without mentioning the taxonomies. The second barrier, when we spoke with capital market participants in Colombia regarding the opportunities that a transition to a low carbon economy brings, they mentioned the lack of labels, common definitions, or classification systems. And as many of you know, taxonomies are the base for are the basis for developing, if you want, a label or to establishing common definitions. So taxonomy was one of I guess it's the building block of our sustainable finance strategy, and it's at the center of the climate finance strategy. So I do feel that continue working with markets like SECO did in Colombia in developing well-structured, under the best practices, local taxonomies is also a good way of keep mobilizing sustainable finance or mobilizing the financial sector towards climate goals.
And it's interesting that you mention your green taxonomy. I know the EU has one in place as well. Jörg, I'd like to get your focus on what Mariana just said before about the SMEs, because you have a lot of experience in that field. What is feasible there when we talk transformation to sustainability?
Well, thank you. Yeah, indeed, I wanted to bring in our own experience as a fund that is a shareholder of approximately 500 medium-sized enterprises, 50 to 500 people that are on the receiving end of this normative wave that's coming in, and asking them to improve on one side and to provide a lot of reports proving that they are improving, right? What you see is certainly a tension between different objectives. And at the micro, like at the micro level, we could speak about Mozambique and Nepal, right? If you are a poor country or if you are a medium-sized enterprise, you are not pursuing one objective. You have to struggle with different challenges at the time. And certainly, first of all, you have to survive and prosper, right? I really think that without medium-sized economy, emerging market and developing country have no chance. So, and the burden or the support that we provide at that level is critical. Now, a lot of what I heard today is not for them. We are speaking about big players, banking that do not reach out there. The financial institutions that deal with them are not the one we are speaking about. The green bonds are far away. I mean, I recognize the critical importance of infrastructure, for instance, obvious that is, but if you speak about employment, especially the creation of a tissue of entrepreneurs that can sustain and create jobs, introduce sustainable technologies, create new markets, you have a lot of conflict of objectives there. And my point is our intervention should be able to address those conflicts of objectives and try to solve them, avoiding to come in with a solution cooked in advance. I mean, our experience is that if you come in and you support entrepreneurs moving as they can in parallel on the financial, on the sustainability, and on the social impact, then you can achieve something. But this implies also that the externalities of these activities are taken care of. I think that what we miss, and I see it from the CFM perspective, even inside the Swiss system, the Swiss development system, are enough synergies between entrepreneur and medium-sized enterprises on one side and the traditional instrument of development cooperation. We can extend later on this, but that's for me is really one of the key issues that we face. Again, speaking about medium-sized enterprises, without which, in my view, there is no chance to structure the economy and make them progress.
Point taken, but that normative wave, as you called it, that could roll over these small and medium-sized enterprises. On the other hand, and here I'd like to get your view, Patrick, you need to have, for investors, you need to have certain standards established that they know what is to be considered a green investment and what not. So how do you deal with this conflict?
Well, perhaps I'd like to start by coming quickly back to the question that was asked about when are the banks going to stop investing into polluting industries.
I mean, if you want to take that one, I was saving that for later, but go right ahead.
It relates to a little bit what you're asking now. And I think, for me, the true question is how are the banks or how is the financial sector going to go about reducing the investment flows into some of the industries that are meant to be damaging our planet. And I think in this respect, it's not that easy, and it will take time. And it all is about transitioning. First point. Second point, I think you're right. There is today a number of difficulties that are technical, which will make the fiduciary duty of a financial institution difficult to exercise. Because after all, in case of doubt in the financial industry, the only thing you have to do is to abstain. And if you have a doubt about the technical metrics or the technical aspects through which you should go in judging about the pertinence of an investment or not, you just don't do it. And perhaps the best way to understand that is that I think personally that the financial industry has moved tremendously in the recent past. And if you go back to the COP, I think it's true that the COP was prominently involved in the financial sector were prominently involved in the last COP. I think one of the reasons is because it's been fully recognized that the financial sector has a prominent role in accelerating that transition, but it hasn't the role to sort of stop from one year to the other doing what it has been done in the past. And that's why what we need now is more agreements, in particular on of course, the metrics, the objectives that have to be reached, in particular to how and with what kind of methodologies you're going to measure the progression on the journey to get to those metrics. And finally, which is not yet been even tackled, how do you transform the result of that journey into a financial impact in the company you're investing to? So we're still far away, but we have moved quite a lot. If you look at the pledges that have been made, although they're not necessarily enough, of course, I think the pledges are second to none. I mean, we've moved to 80% of the financial sector having basically pledged for net zero, and I think it's true in every country, and now it's a question of execution.
I also want to talk about the role of governmental institutions here. Arno, before you explain to us what the Green Bond Technical Initiative does, but what can international cooperation and the international community that's gathered here, for example, in Switzerland, do to increase green investments in the countries where they're active?
Thank you. Is this?
Yes.
Yeah. And it types to Philippe's question also that he posed to me in the chat. Look, there are two fundamental gaps, if I put it today. With all these pledges and commitments, the world wanting to do the right thing, there's not a demand side problem. There's money wanting to go into this. The challenge, of course, is the risk perception. That's one, and we can talk about how to address that, but that's significant. But essentially, it's a data problem. It's a supply side problem of these projects. The data problem is most of these entities don't even know how to calculate their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. You start there. So the second part, the supply side, is framing those projects to attract the private sector in there. There's just a significant challenge in all of these areas. And so what we can do is the challenge can be addressed by capacity building, by knowledge transfer. That's the number one part in helping these players understand what they need to do. And for SMEs especially, and even some of the big banks, you need to have some tools. So, for example, a long time ago, and it's been a journey for IFC in terms of, looking at our own portfolio, estimating, what the impact is, what the GHG emissions are. I talked to some of the big banks who made these pledges. It took them a year to figure out what is their baseline emissions. And some of them are still trying to figure that out before. They made the net zero commitment to 2050, but they didn't even know where their baseline figures were.
You would figure they're good with numbers, though.
Right.
It's a financial industry.
There's that data to go down to your portfolio of, $3 trillion, some of the largest banks, and say, hey, what is the emissions of my portfolio? And it's not easy. It's there's a gap out there. And so that's what one needs to address, whether it's big companies. So in capacity building, I think we have a significant way of, the second is tools, and the third is finance in all its different forms. We heard some examples of blended finance, and IFC, for example, we realized on the supply side problem, and Jörg was on the board. We had several discussions, but this time our strategy was we created something called an upstream unit, nothing to do with upstream oil and gas, but was to actually develop projects. We no longer wait for projects to come to us. We are out there looking at a country context or a sector context and saying what makes sense, what can we help galvanize a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road. Till you address the supply side problem, there's that money will be waiting in pension funds and invested in AAA asset bonds here rather than flowing to emerging market context.
Okay, and the risk perception is one of the key things that you mentioned, and I'd like to get Mariana in on this because, there's risk involved. If I want to invest in Colombia, it's not like investing in Switzerland, for example. Why do you think financial institutions take that risk and invest in Colombia?
That's a hard question. I think if we're talking about sustainable finance perspective, I think initially it's because of the standards we have followed. The local market has made an effort, and as I said before, initially from a voluntary perspective, and now under different regulations that the superintendency is issuing, they have committed to maintaining or establishing or incorporating best practices in order to really attract capital. When we spoke, for example, with the green bond issuers, we were at the beginning of our journey, wanted to understand what were the main barriers in Colombia and or what can we do to incentivize more of this issuance. And one of the reasons they said, or one of the benefits they perceive, is diversify the investor base. So since this is the biggest incentive for them, they try and they want to maintain best practices in Colombia. So and this is just my assumption. I don't have the information or the data to really corroborate this, but I am assuming it's because it's perceived as a market that it's really committed to establishing best practices, and that gives a little bit of security or assurance to participants that want to take the risk and come to Colombia.
And apart from risk, we also talked about impact investment. And here, Jörg, the SDC has supported impact investment, for example, together with SECO. We've heard about the SYNC initiatives. But do you think that approaches like this, they focus on singular projects and singular regions and all that, how are they adaptable? Are they scalable, depending on which country we're talking about? Because we need big approaches.
Do you allow me first to say something on data from
Sure.
the producing side? The bank that has to present data, they have asked the borrower to produce them. This is the same situation we are in as development financial institutions, right? We have norms, government asks us to bring evidence. At the end of the line, you have a company that has, again, 100, 200 people that has to generate very complex data and that has to respond to demand from data from different sources, from different financiers that are different. This is an unnecessary burden. Then we cascade down our own normative line. And I think, for me, a lot of development assistance is devoted to government to formulate objective and not enough to measure, and I would say, put a proportional burden on employers and enterprises to generate the necessary data. We don't have...
So you think it's a reporting problem?
We have a huge reporting cost that makes it difficult to measure impact. Again, I'm not speaking about the big companies, right? I'm speaking about the vital middle-sized company that determine what an economy does. And the production of data is a very high-cost, complex situation that we create in large part, as DFI and others. So a big effort, in my view, that should come from the donors is to force, for a country, unify reporting data and force investors, doesn't matter if they come in green or blue, if they want to invest in the country, they have to accept the reporting system that is probably will be different for a 50, for a 100, and for a 1,000 company. But you know, is a very huge challenge, I think, for entrepreneurs, right? So, I mean, I would deposit that because I really think that in the discussion with development agency, this could be an issue. And in the also discussion on measuring impact, this is for me a big issue that I see from where I stand and where I have to justify to my government why I invest here and there. To your question, you know, let me go to the Mozambique case, because it's for me is one of the most dramatic, right? Arun was mentioning the investment in the gas fields of Cabo Delgado. They make sense in a country that produces coals, right? But the investment, those gas fields have created a civil war. They have contributed massively to a civil war that has displaced 600,000 people over the last 3 years. So my point is, if you don't address structural development issue that goes with your renewable whatever investment, you risk to create more problems in those countries than you generate. And I suppose that this is partly the experience of the infrastructure investment. I mean, if they don't take into account the social costs when they come in, you have huge problem and you don't get return and sustainability. So, you know, the point is you cannot conceive sustainable investment without an holistic approach, and therefore we need synergies, right? So that's my plea here for moving ahead.
And I also see a bit of a dilemma here, that on the one hand you want to have solutions that fit an individual market and really acknowledge circumstances, local circumstances, and on the other hand there have to be some international or global standards, or else you risk running into that greenwashing. We saw the word cloud before with Eric Osher, that greenwashing was the most mentioned word that comes to mind in this, because if you have standards that are all over the place, then everyone picks and chooses, and you're not really sure what you're dealing with, right?
Yes, I think it's a pity actually that this debate on greenwashing is taking so much of an importance, because it sort of distracts a little bit what is already being done in the right direction. And I think it's true that we should avoid by all means to sort of produce services and products in the financial industry that do not meet their promises. And there are means to do that, but there is also plenty of legislation that prevent that everywhere practically in the world. I think what we should do in this respect is probably increase the ability of developing, of course, generally accepted standards. When it comes to less developed countries, I think it is clear that the mainstream investors at this stage are not per definition going to move from one day to the other into more volumes in the less developed countries. Today it corresponds to a generally accepted per institution or sector or country asset allocation. That's it, and it will probably be always like this if you put yourself back into the context of an investment bank, for instance. Mm-hmm. But what is difficult is, for instance, when it comes to be more active in new solutions pertaining to some of the big challenges that we have. Let me just take the example of decarbonization, for instance. We know that one way of fighting correctly the trend is, of course, to reduce the production of emission. Another one is to do even more than reducing it, but to try to compensate some of what has been done in the meantime, because you can't do it immediately. And in order to do that, you have to have the right projects and the right infrastructure or the right ideas that you can, or the right SMEs or the right firms that you can develop, including in emerging countries. In order to do that, you have to have these generally accepted standards that were mentioned, including in the field of government agreements in the way of sharing the benefits. Let me explain. If an investor from a country has to compensate and chooses deforestation, probably it's going to be much cheaper to try to finance an objective or a project in the field of deforestation in less developed countries than it is in the developed countries. Who gets the benefits of these investments? Is this the one that has made the investment in the developed country universe, or is this a sharing of the benefit between the less developed countries, including the company doing it, and the developed countries? This is an issue that is not solved today, and that needs to be solved. So international standards are really useful, and they are becoming even more useful now when it comes to solving solutions such as financing projects that may alleviate faster some of these, for instance, decarbonization trends.
And I read that you also have a climate score that you developed to see if investments are Paris-proof, so to speak. How does that work exactly?
Well, it all goes back to this idea of risk. Actually, and that fits very well with your previous question, I think the greenwashing issue is intimately linked to the commercial aspect of what we're talking about. You're trying to sell, you sell superficially, or you don't sell with a proof of concept that is fully scientifically based, and then you get very quickly into superficial solutions and greenwashing. If you approach sustainable investing the way, for instance, we do, by trying to avoid the risks, it's totally different. And in order to do that by way of avoiding the risk, you have to develop a notion of what is the objectives and how do you get to this objective. An alignment of the portfolio to an objective that you've set. Let's take the Paris Agreement objective. The portfolio has to be aligned to the Paris Agreement objectives. What is important, and that's where the scores come in, what is important is to have the measurement capacity to justify the choice of an investment or the choice of not taking the investment in the portfolios. And these kinds of methodologies are yet to be fully standardized, but they are emerging, and they have emerged and now being close to be accepted by the G20, such as the TCFD portfolio alignment teams, imply temperature rise, for instance, methodologies. This is what we need now, an agreement on how you measure correctly the degree of realization of the objectives that you correctly set on the portfolio, and so how do you avoid the major risks of being in the wrong industries at the right time.
I'd also get to want to hear what Mariana has to say on the greenwashing topic, because you're on the ground, and is that a problem in Colombia?
Yes, I mean, I don't know if it's a problem. It's a worry. Like when we discuss with capital markets participants, one of the regulatory purposes of many, or the purposes of many interventions are obviously to avoid greenwashing. So just to talk about the taxonomy, which is, from my perspective, one of the most ambitious projects we have in the Superintendencia regarding green finance. Part of the intentionality of a taxonomy in an emerging market is to avoid greenwashing. So it is a worry, but it's also very important to note and annotate that it's a different. I mean, it comes from a different perspective. I think most of the greenwashing that could happen in countries like Colombia could be due to lack of knowledge or capacity, like somebody else said. It's not necessarily something they do it intentionally. It's just they don't have the information, they don't have the knowledge, and they can, incur in greenwashing. The other aspect that is very important to note is the different ways of incurring in greenwashing. So I know here most of the discussions and the latest discussion on this issue around these commitments. In countries like Colombia, we don't have many financial institutions or capital market participants making strong commitments publicly. We don't have that yet. We have green bonds. You can obviously you can incur in greenwashing risk when you issue a green bond that is not properly structured, you can incur in greenwashing when you market a product as green, a voluntary pension fund or this type of funds, and you can incur in greenwashing when you label it green. But in the commitments themselves, we don't see it yet. We don't have that problem yet because there are not many organizations making this type of commitments. We only, just to give you an idea, we only have one bank with starting to establish and to communicate a little bit of their intentions to establish a commitment, like a net zero commitment, a carbon neutral, but it's not something that is happening as strong as in Europe, which most institutional investors join these networks or public commitments organizations. We don't have banks establishing this type of commitments. So this is, from that perspective, it's not a problem yet. But we are in the right moment, and actually, I think this is the best. This is the right forum to say we are, for an emerging market perspective. I think there is an opportunity for international cooperation to really set up or build the capacity locally for these commitments to be established in a very transparent and under best practices. No, so we are in the right moment to really move the market and not, we're to develop these commitments in the best practice, under the best practices. So I'm going to leave it at that, but yeah.
Establish them early on, so there is no accidental greenwashing, so to speak. Internationally, at the G20, for example, we see that sustainable finance standards and disclosure frameworks, such as the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, they are on the rise. And Arno, isn't there also a risk that and it relates to what Jörg said, that we end up with a definition of sustainable finance that is just tailored to those countries, the G20 types, leaving behind those most in need?
So that's an interesting question, and I think it's being played out right now, even in the European and developed world context. Mm-hmm. You have for example, on climate risk, you have stress tests and models. Most banks don't know how to apply them. We've tried it, and we find it not very practical in use today. So we've got theory leading way ahead of practice right now in the world today. So when you take the TCFD recommendations, scenario analysis is one of them, and you take an emerging market bank context, as I was talking about, the bank says, okay, I want to decarbonize, but first I need to know what is, again, the baseline of my portfolio, mm-hmm. right? So getting that data. And then if you have this reporting requirements under TCFD that says, okay, you have certain ways to mitigate this climate risk, both from the transition risk and the physical risk, I need to know what the risk is in my portfolio. And I think that knowledge, so when you have the reporting, what TCFD has is the end product is a reporting. But underlying our systems, there's governance, there's risk management, there's metrics. All of that requires capacity building at that level. Now, does that mean we should create a lower standard? No, I think the framework needs to be the same. And as we pondered this when we made our Paris alignment commitment, we actually saw, okay, you can have a ladder, and you can have different stages of growth. For a bank that's starting out, let's make sure they have a strategy in place, they begin to put metrics in place. For a bank that's slightly more advanced, okay, let them engage with, on other activities from, putting more targets on there, so we have building blocks for these banks to think of in terms of so whether you're a beginner. Right, so it has to be tailored. You can have the same standard and say this is it, and over time we will transition to this. It can't be today. You can't ask for it today. The SEC has just come out with a regulation in the US on disclosure. It's behind the EU, but it's taken a practical approach to doing that. But it means now the number of people have to be trained in how it's actually done. It will take a few years before, even in the developed context like the US, you can have something like that adopted. So I don't think it's a matter of diluting the standards. It's a matter of being practical in the implementation, building the capacities, and making sure that the objective remains the same and you work towards it. We have to look at it as a journey rather than a hard stop, one-step process.
and using building blocks, but just you have to agree what kind of house you want to build in the end so that you can get there. So now let's get to our questions. We have a lot of them that came in on Slido. Thanks a lot for participating, whether you are online or here in the room. First one goes to Mr. Odier. In addition to incentivize private finance, shouldn't development cooperation funds also be spent on combating capital flight and tax evasion in order to finance sustainable developments and adaptation to climate change?
Of course. And this is being done. Absolutely. I think it all goes and ties together. I think what we're talking about here is channeling capital in a way that is sustainable from a societal point of view, and tax evasion is certainly not. And I think that if you add to the fact that the banks can avoid that, the fact that they can also not only avoid problems but create solutions, I think the financial sector has a huge role yet to play in some of these issues. Again, when it comes to the less developed countries, I think this is there's beyond the problem of data and perhaps the cultural aspect, which makes, for instance, the judgmental part of a decision-making quite difficult. Frankly speaking, the notion of governance in an Anglo-Saxon way is absolutely different from the notion of government in other types of mentalities and philosophies. So there will be differences, but what is right, what is correct now is to try to foster, and even if it is starting with the G20s, doesn't matter, it's the right approach, not again concluding on whether this metrics or this methodology is the one to use, but at least that the way it's been defined is correct. That is to be achieved now, and I think the financial sector is really putting a lot of efforts on that, including in this country, with in Switzerland, where of course the Ministry of Finance has understood that challenge and is now to foster on a science-based framework the right methods to measure the portfolio alignments of the investments that are recommended or made by the financial sector. And I think this is the way it's going to go also for the less developed countries' projects or companies that have to be financed.
And the next question I would like to hand to you is that could Switzerland leverage sustainable finance better by setting up a green climate bank as other countries have done? Maybe Jörg, you want to take this one? Green climate bank, what do you think of this idea?
Look, we can put up whatever. I mean, I'm really concerned about the absorption capacity at the local level. So maybe it's not a question for me. We are trying.
Well, you can disagree with the question. That's fine.
No. My point is, I don't think it's a real question. There is not lack of money in my view at all. It's lack of capacity to translate into reality.
Green finance, but also social finance.
So I wanted to give an example here. One of our companies, we are small shareholders there, a mattress producing company in Nairobi, in the neighborhood of Nairobi. The conflicts there. First, they produce mattresses that cost from $10 to $200. For us, it's critical that they continue to produce the $10 mattresses for obvious reasons, right?
Yes.
Second, they employ 250 people. Half of them are casual employees. So we try and we insist that most of them, if not all of them, get a normal contract, are protected against health incidents and so on. That's a typical. Third, the government asked them to use the train from Mombasa to bring in the commodities that they need to produce the mattresses. Using the train, as you know, the debt problem linked to that train would impose on the company a huge burden because it costs a lot more to bring in the train and the delays in bringing in the material than using the truck. Of course, the conflict is obvious, right? Between low emission and bringing in and producing the $10 mattresses. What I'm saying is that, you try to combine this and you do the best, but you are constantly confronted with trade-offs and you need patience to solve these problems. And you cannot just measure success in one way. Go, with a complex triangle of objectives and try to advance as much as you can. I'm pleading for a differentiated responsibility and capacity to report not only at the global level, at the country level, but also at the enterprise level, with a specific treatment of the company that build the economies. You know, for me, so the answer is yes, but we need instruments that allow that, and we need enough synergy with subsidies and cooperation for make this possible.
There's also a question that I think is rather timely. How can we incentivize international investment in conflict-affected areas, given the risks of returns in unstable contexts? Beyond the general goal of sustainability, investment in conflict-affected areas can also support peace. Maybe Mariana from Colombia would like to know what you think about this.
It's an interesting question. I think, to be honest, I think from what I've seen, again, I don't have data necessarily to sustain what I'm going to say. It's more of my personal view. Most of the times, investors that are looking to invest in countries like Colombia, which basically we're out of a peace process, so it kind of describes exactly the situation that the person is asking. Normally, they tend to have, they tend to understand the country a little bit better. They try that they have, you know, they have information, or they have the ability to gather and analyze information in order to really assess the risk in a country like Colombia, including that one associated with the peace process. It's really important to note that in a country like Colombia, also the most affected areas from the conflict are rural areas, are small agro producers in the country that are the most affected ones. And they're normally not the target of these investments, but we need in Colombia, for example, is one of the priorities. We need to mobilize even public capital to those areas, because that's the way you consolidate peace. But my short answer is it's around information and getting the context. It's the only thing I can think of, because it is a really actually hard question to answer that I don't have all the information to provide, but that's what I think.
Okay, thank you, Mariana. And I think you wanted to add to this?
I don't know if it works. Yeah. Yes, it works. I fully agree with what was just said. It's a very difficult question. It's basically, how do you invest in the uninvestable universe? And you know, it answers the question by asking the question this way. But I think there are mechanisms. There are now possibilities to blend, if I may use that word in this respect, organizations that know about what needs to be done with private capital, for instance, and perhaps with the help of outcome funders that exist. And we've done. I just give you an example. We discussed with the ICRC a few years ago such a model that would allow, for instance, in difficult countries to invest into medical capacities, to sort of avoid having the huge cost burden of having to transfer refugee, and usually refugee of war with wounds to very far away hospitals, to keep them there, but having the right production of medical supplies that are needed to be treating these people and victims of war, for instance. This was a system that basically allowed investors to get into the program, knowing that the organization that was taking the responsibility of supervising this program was the best position to do it, knowing that the base return was there. It was a return very competitive to any, in this case it was a private loan, so to any fixed income market instrument, but knowing also that if it didn't go wrong, of course the private sector would bear completely the risk, and if it did go right, the private sector would get the benefit, and the benefit in this respect would be a fairly sizable premium. And I think this has worked pretty well, simply because there's huge capital interest, although it's difficult to say it at the outset. There's huge capital interest to do it with the right party for the right project. It's much more difficult to do it as a generic investment.
And even more difficult to set standards than when it comes to the ecological sustainability, of course, because it's much more volatile. We have time for one last question, I think. How should international funding be laid out for just decarbonization of developing economies? That's a rather general one. Maybe Arnab, you want to take this?
That number.
It's got 4 votes, so yeah.
Well, how should international funding be laid out for just decarbonization in developing economies? I think it starts with a plan. It starts with a plan for decarbonization in the context, and we've had lots of discussion around this. Coal, for example, decommissioning coal. You can decommission a coal plant, but it has many offshoots around it. So in the Indian context, for example, or the South African context, there are railways that transport this coal. And that transport of coal has such significant revenues for the railway that it subsidizes the passenger traffic. You have mines that are impacted with it. So you could close a coal plant, power plant, but then after that, you've got a whole impact on this. So I think when you think of, in a just, decarbonization, you've got to think of who are the most vulnerable, where should the private sector go, and where should the public sector go. I think it needs to be clearly laid out in a plan that does that. So often we are asked as the private sector financier, what are you doing in just transition? So sure, we are providing financing to a solar project or a waste treatment project, and there is little just a room for just transition by the private sector entity that's looking at the returns from the project, bidding, and in today's context, the solar prices are down to 2 cents a kilowatt hour in the most competitive bids. There's not enough room for the financier to say, yes, and I will take care of the other communities losing their jobs in that. Now, what has worked well, and there's some good examples, is to say, going in, I'm going to set up this, are there some industries that are going to lose jobs, and I could get from there and train them? But it needs a partnership with the public sector to do that. So again, it'll be capacity retraining of some of those people and bringing them into the new industries that are being developed. So it's a process that then can direct money appropriately to the different players.
Thank you. I love the variety of questions we have here. You can see that there's a lot of different sectors being represented in this discussion. Thank you all for those who posed these questions, and of course, thank you for participating in this panel. Mariana Escobar Uribe, Patrick Audier, Jörg Frieden, and Arnab Yagwani. Thank you. Well, it was a lot of input, right, and a lot of insight. So let's take stock now and talk about what some of the most important takeaways are for you from this session, for our audience, and we'll hear from the experts themselves as well. We'll do this in a very open format, and we will use Slido again to do this with a live survey. And later on, we will have live reactions here on stage to what you will be saying on that Slido survey. Please go on. You see, there is here in one sentence, what is your key takeaway from this session? So, well, let's see what we'll hear there. And you can tell us what you think. To discuss this, I now welcome Martin Salonen, the Deputy Head of Economic Cooperation and Development Division at the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, and Françoise Salameke, Head of the Climate Network there. Hello. So, maybe personally, where did you see most actual progress today in our discussion, Martin?
Well, I think most progress was made by hearing all of you from, as you said before, different angles, and having a panel here with people who are also coming from different angles, bringing knowledge to the table. I'm very sorry it was not longer, because we could have talked about all these questions far longer, and they would have all been equally interesting.
Absolutely, but we're trying to keep time here, being all Swiss.
So if you ask me for the main takeaways, maybe from this discussion today, I think I share with Françoise Salamé the takeaways, because there could be many, but I focus on two. One for me is very much on the role of the public sector as compared to the role of the private sector. What is the public sector actually doing best? And I think it was said by Mariana, by others, the public sector has to set up the right framework conditions. We have to set up the right enabling environment so that the private sector, including the financial sector, can work. We have to come in and make sure that the environment is such that we can have enough space to place all the money which is out there. There is not a lack of money, it was said, and I'm very sure that's the case. There is more a lack of training and a lack of bringing the demand side also up to speed. The second point, which for me is very important, is the one on standards. A lot was said about standards, about greenwashing, and I think standards is something where we really have to focus from our side, and that's a specialty we have at SECO and SDC. Standards are, again, framework conditions. We can work a lot around climate data. It was said by Anup, for instance, that we bring in the right data. You have baselines you can work on. You can assess a risk also following baselines established. I think that's very important. But you also need enough capacity, and that was also said several times, capacity to take up the supply, the money which is around, and to know what you are doing. And that's then coming then maybe to training. And training is something we are good in. We are doing in several fields, and mainly also in the field of impact and sustainable finance. And I think in terms of standards, we can also use standards we are establishing and working on in Switzerland. Like there is a climate score we have in Switzerland. If you take a fridge and look what is the scorecard to the fridge, could be an idea to take that further, to show that others how this is working. You're combining sort of, well, assessments behind the assessment and make it more understandable for people. So these are takeaways for me in terms of framework conditions and the role of the public side, and standards and greenwashing, all to be deepened. We have enough time afterwards maybe to talk about that more.
Absolutely, that's why we're here. Françoise, what are your main takeaways?
Yeah, so as I said, Martin talked about policies, he talked about standards. I'll talk about financial instruments, because indeed financial instruments are also very much important. We heard about green bonds, we heard about sustainability bonds, and we heard about de-risk blended finance, which are de-risking instruments. And something that was very important that came on and on during the discussion and the panel is the idea of building capacities, providing the training to banks, to companies, to utilities, so that they can issue the green bonds. And we heard also a lot about greenwashing. And if we want to avoid this greenwashing, well, we need to have this training that will help the issuers do a good job. And this is something that Mariana also touched upon when she intervened. Beyond that, we heard a very interesting presentation of PIDGE. And in PIDGE, we've seen that blended finance is actually critical to reduce the risk of investors. Here again, Anup told us, well, the money is here. We need to de-risk. We need to work on data. Data is through training, as I said before, but also de-risking is important. And instruments like grants for some pre-feasibility studies, but also equity, long-term loans, and guarantee over local currency loans can help and can allow us to de-risk the investments and attract the investors. And here we had a challenger in the presentation. We had Jörg Frieden, who told us, well, nice, everything you're telling us is more for big companies. What do we do with SMEs? So the question is, are green bonds only done for big companies? Well, that's an open question. I'm not sure. I mean, that's what you told us, Jörg, but I guess there is still place for bonds for smaller companies. But still, the point is, we might need to adapt this whole structure for SMEs, for companies that might not have the status or the capacity to handle all these requirements. So that's perhaps a point for us, in our work in in SECO and SDC, is there something we should do to help SMEs get into this climate support? And finally, and that was also a very important point that came from many panelists, is the journey. We're on a journey. It's going to take time. And even in Switzerland, if we think of UBS or if we think about Credit Suisse, right now they are hiring the people. They are building their own capacity to become, to take climate into their work. So it's a journey also for us to build the capacities in developing countries, taking into consideration their priorities and their constraints. Thank you.
Can I just add one small point, and that is a teaser for tomorrow. We have a workshop 8 on just transition, only because just transition came up in the end in the discussion on the panel, and I can only welcome you there, if you may. Thanks.
And some of the things that you've just mentioned are also the key takeaways from our audience. I read here that the problem is not the lack of money, but the lack of capacity and conflicts of interest. We talked about this. So the international cooperation can play an important role in risk reduction. That was also an important point you mentioned. And finance's purpose should be to finance the needs of society. Yes, that's a very principled one. But we have a critical one too, that just if you could move up again, the one that was just on top, that there were not enough views from developing countries and their view what their finance need really is. You think there should be more of this?
Well, I'm very happy that Mariana was in the room.
Yes.
We had also a colleague from Kenya in the room for the SYNC. I think we are doing that very much, of course, with our partner countries, and I know that all our implementing partners, Pitch, CFM, IFC, and so on and so forth, are working on that very much. I mean, we otherwise work in an empty space, and that's certainly not what we want. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So I think we had a lot of perspectives for today, but we are approaching, we're actually over time already, I'm so sorry. We did not hit our target or when it comes to the timing, but I think we'll have plenty to discuss later in the reception that will follow. But this, for the moment, is it for the official part. I thank you, Martin and Françoise. Finally, I want to let you know that tomorrow at 9 a.m. local time, we will be back for our next plenary session. Now you can enjoy that reception that I referred to, or get to know your fellow participants even more at the International Cooperation Forum, or for our virtual audience, you can meet up in the spatial chat. So enjoy, see you tomorrow.